2 minutes to get cookies chat for a little bit. So hopefully everyone's got the sugar high going on. Good afternoon. I hope you were able to enjoy the sunshine today. Welcome to today's Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe. I'm Dana Fulton, a meteorologist, anchor, producer. We can talk about that later at WKOW. Our station is proud to be the media sponsor for these events. I'd like to welcome everyone, of course, to the East Side Club today. Hopefully, again, you were able to get outside a little bit this afternoon, or at least just look out the window every once in a while. We should look at Tyler mostly the next hour, but I encourage you also just enjoy the view. Did you know 2 weeks ago was National Invasive Species Awareness Week? Timing up well with today's presentation. Titled Aquatic Invasive Species in Wisconsin Lakes, New Insights and Lessons Learned. Today's talk will look at how aquatic invasive species are impacting our lakes throughout Wisconsin, and specifically here in the Yahara chain of lakes. We're going to review their spread, impacts, and what it means for lake health and management in our changing world. We are going to have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. We're going to get to as many questions as possible, so I do ask that you save your questions until the end of the presentation, and on the off chance that everyone has a question, we don't get to everyone, there will be an opportunity to email your questions in afterwards. We'll definitely get those answers back to you. Before we start today's talk, I want to introduce you to somebody who you guys know and love, of course. James Ty is going to give us a few more updates about Clean Lakes Alliance, as well as tell us a little bit more about today's speaker.
Thank you, Dana. Everybody awake? Everybody awake? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, the sun is out, which is just wonderful. I like everybody coming out here to East Side Club, our new home for Clean Lakes Alliance 101s. And just really appreciate all these sponsors that make this thing possible, including National Guardian Life Insurance, our partner at East Side Club, Johnson Financial Group, Alliant Energy, Perkins Coie, also our partners at UW Nelson Institute, WKOW, and UW Extension. Also, just like to really thank Dana for all of her work at WKOW and really truly believing in the efforts of the Clean Lakes Alliance. A few quick updates. First of all, if you've not reviewed your friendship with the Clean Lakes Alliance or your partnership with the Clean Lakes Alliance, we do encourage you to do that. It takes a whole bunch of little donations to make our efforts work. So please renew that donation, or you can also give again. Thank you for the laugh in the back. Who's who laughed? That's awesome. You can give twice. Also, just want to remind people that on Thursday, you'll be getting an invitation for our Clean Lakes Alliance Community Breakfast, Tuesday, May 13th. This is now our biannual event. We will present the State of Lakes report, plus we're going to have voices of the watershed. So we'll hear from a lot of different people in a lot of different ways about how they love our lakes and how they're making an impact to improve water quality. Individual tickets are on sale. There's retired versions and government rate. There's also a regular rate, and even people want to give a little bit more. You can give $124.50, so $123.45, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, representing the 5 lakes. If you want to just give a little bit more. We also have Loop the Lake. Its registration is now open. This is our wonderful community event celebrating and coming together the Saturday before Father's Day every year. We had almost 2,000 with 1,856, correct, Paul and Caitlin last year. So we're hoping to break that 2,000 mile marker. And really, if you work for a community organization, I think Lance is here from Princess Starkweather. We are looking for partners to help us run some of our stops throughout the watershed. We've got interesting stops along the ride. They can learn about different projects or different community organizations as you tour around Lake Monona. A couple other types of things going on is I'm going to have to get my readers up. My apologies. We're really excited to have today's talk with Dr. Tyler here, who's a limnologist and ecosystem scientist who received a PhD in 2018. Thank you, Dr. Tyler. And who's going to talk about everything that's going on in our lakes and across the state, especially impacts on Lake Mendota. He'll have more to share and also be available for questions at the end of the talk. Welcome, Dr. Butts.
Thank you, and I'm excited to talk with you all folks today about a somewhat troublesome topic, but hopefully, while there'll be a little bit of doom and gloom as with any thing with invasive species, there's also some hope and some cool things that we've learned as scientists about invasives over the last 2 decades or so. So as I'm sure many folks are aware, lakes are increasingly being affected by multiple species invasions. Not just one, but invasions in succession. A great example of that is our very own lakes Mendota and Monona, who have been invaded by Eurasian water milfoil, spiny water flea, and zebra mussels, which are very common invasives here in Wisconsin that I'm sure many, if not all, have you all heard about. But there's also other invasives around. There's of course spiny water flea, rusty crayfish in the corner there. The classic red spots, which can be really devastating to aquatic plant communities and lakes. Common carp, which have been with us for a long time now. It's solely more non-native species than invasive, but can be really, they kick up a lot of the sediments in lakes and can make them turn very cloudy and disturb a lot of other aspects of ecosystem function. You've probably seen pictures of these flying fish in the Mississippi River, silver carp and bighead carp. Which can cause concussions for boaters on those rivers, as well as feed on a lot of prey resources native fish like to feed on. Anybody with a dock or probably knows this is Eurasian water milfoil, a really nasty aquatic invasive plant that can shade over other native plants. And of course, as I mentioned before, we have zebra mussels up in the corner there and spiny water flea, which are tiny microscopic crustaceans that can have pretty outsized impacts. And so these are all invasive species that we find and will find in our Wisconsin lakes. And while efforts to prevent the spread of invasive species have been really successful, wash your boats, wash your gear when you're entering and leaving lakes, the unfortunate reality is that we can't stop every single invasive species. And new invasions are likely going to continue to happen coming from the Great Lakes into Wisconsin lakes, or traveling on boats or through birds to other systems in our country. And invasives are likely going to continue to spread. And so something to just emphasize this point a little bit. So this plot is from a great paper by Bradley et al. And the y-axis here is sort of the rate of invasive species spread. And the blue bar is native species, how they're spreading to different territories under projections of what climate change is going to do as temperatures get warmer, and new habitats become suitable. Native species are expected to spread at 247 kilometers a year, whereas non-native spread versus non-native introductions, so new invasive species coming in, are far surpass what those native species can endure. And that 3.25 line is the level at which those species would need to spread to keep up with the pace of climate change, right? So native species are a little below that, the error is a little bit over. And this is true across tons of different animal groups. So mammals, birds, raven fishes, gastropods, plants, different kinds of plants. And so that to say, non-native species are expanding their ranges orders of magnitude faster than native species. And non-native species have a lot larger potential ranges. They're invasive in a lot of ways because they can withstand a lot of different types of environments, or can live more generally than native species, which tend to be adapted to their specific systems. And they can have very broad climate tolerances. And so this is a fairly bleak picture of not exactly how I want to start this talk, but understanding how invasives are going to impact new systems and how they're changing the clockwork of lakes and rivers that they're already in, so we can develop tools that we can use to lessen or eliminate their impacts is more important now than ever. And luckily for all of us here, we have the wonderful laboratory of Lake Mendota. This was taken by an airplane pilot working on a project at the Center for Limnology last summer. And on the shores of Lake Mendota, as well as right in the center, are, of course, our fearless data collector, David Bowie, right out in the center of the lake. If you pass by it in the summer, picture the way below, and the Center for Limnology in this sort of Soviet-era brutalist building on the lake. But it's great to work in. And folks at the Center for Limnology have been collecting data on lakes since the late 1800s, the Judean Burge, and North American limnology started here in Madison. And particularly, we've had this long-running, long-term ecological research program called the North Temperate Lakes LTER, Long-Term Ecological Research, which has been collecting data on lakes, long-term data on lakes since 1981 in a number of lakes up north in the Northwoods, as well as since 1995 down here in Madison on Lake Mendota and Monona, as well as Lake Wingra and Fish Lake. And this goes towards an emphasis on thinking about long-term limnology, or a phrase coined by one of the founders and leaders of the Center for Limnology, or founders of LTR, and one of the directors of the Center for Limnology at the time, John Magnuson, looking beyond the visible present. So sort of taking this long-term view to see how lakes are changing over time. And that's one of the things that the LTER is really, really good at doing. And so we wanted to, at the CFL, sort of look back at the LTER data and see what lessons we can learn. This is sort of the promise of the premise of this talk. This paper came out last year, led by my postdoc advisor, Jake van der Zanden, and a number of other grad students and other folks affiliated with the Center for Limnology, where they put together 9 lessons about aquatic invasive species from the NTL-LTR program. And a lot of these, and I'm going to go over these 9 lessons today and talk about sort of what we've learned, as well as some new projects and work that we're doing as scientists at the CFL. And a lot of that's going to be focused on things like spiny water flea and zebra mussels, a bit on Eurasian water milfoil, and to broaden it out to Wisconsin in general, I'll talk a little bit about bighead and silver carp as well. And so we'll be, like I said, talking about some of the work. That's my arm, taking a sample on Lake Mendota, and then sort of the broader, looking at the broader picture of waters across Wisconsin, what that means. So 9 lessons. We'll walk through this at a pretty good pace, hopefully, with time for questions at the end. But so first lesson, invasive species are more widespread than has been previously documented. So when we look at sort of maps of where invasive species are to sort of get at how expansive are they, where are they spreading, we often see maps like this that the U.S. Geological Survey might put out. This is a distribution map of zebra and quagga mussel sightings across the U.S. Some of them where there's just zebra mussels, some where there's just quagga mussels. Quagga mussels are the sort of bigger mussel down in the corner there. They've almost completely overtaken zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. And just a few months ago, there was a sighting in Lake Geneva in Wisconsin of a quagga mussel. And so it seems to be they're starting to spread a little bit now as well. But oftentimes these maps are just, was there a sighting? Was there a report of an invasive species in this lake? And that's really tracking occurrence. It doesn't really get at how many of those invasives are in that lake or the impact of their invasion. So one of the cool projects, this was led by Alex Latska, who did some of his grad work at the Center for Limnology. He looked at this map of Wisconsin. Those yellow circles are historical records from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources about where they detected invasive species. And then the red circles were like a stratified sampling run that Alex and a bunch of other folks took to look at different lake types and see, did we detect invasive species? And looking solely at WDNR records, only about 12% of lakes in Wisconsin were reported to be invaded. But when Alex and other folks did using the LTR resources and data and did this stratified sample of lakes where they took a sample of lakes, different kind of types. Alex's numbers put the value more at 36 to 49% invaded. So that's a pretty big jump, and it's not a great value you want to see, but it sort of shows that just relying on presence or absence and reports of invasive species might be severely underestimating how far spread a lot of these invasives are. And how could that happen? I mean, normally when you hear about an invasive species, it's because they're exploding in abundance or having really severe impacts, which kind of brings me to our second lesson, which is that invasive species are actually usually at low abundance, which might be counterintuitive to what a lot of folks have heard or thought about before, as usually when you think of a thing like zebra mussels, you picture something like this, where a shopping cart was left in a lake, and it was heavily colonized by tons and tons of zebra mussels. I tried to find one with a Memorial Union Terrace chair, but I couldn't find one. But a similar thing would likely happen. Any hard surface, or when you pull up a dock in the fall, likely at least in 2016 or 2017, quite covered in zebra mussels. But when looking over lots of space and lots of lakes, we actually see that, and this was led by Gretchen Hansen, who's now at the University of Minnesota. They found that the distribution patterns of invasives follow pretty closely to what we'd expect to native species. So this plot here is brown goby, an invasive fish in the Great Lakes, as well as other places. And we see this sort of right skew, where there's lots of sites that have a pretty low catch per unit effort of an invasive species. And this is true across tons of different types of invasives, not just brown goby, but just pulling this one out for an example. And the sort of challenges are conventional wisdom that invasives can explode into any system that they get into, which can happen. Obviously, there's lots of examples of that. But invasives can be in lots of different lakes, but sort of operating under the radar at low abundances that might be harder for folks that are doing surveys to detect. However, though, on average, from this work, they found that invasives were still tended to have higher densities than native species, and their density patterns were a lot more variable than native. So they're not completely following to what we would expect of native species, but the overall distribution of invasive species in the landscape, looking across lots and lots of different lakes, was fairly similar to natives, where they're mostly at low densities. So when an invasive species is at a low density, you might think, okay, great. We don't have to worry about this. It's not really causing that big of an issue. But with the third lesson in this paper about what we learned is that environmental changes can cause these low density populations to boom. And so when we have a lot of these sort of sleeper populations, where lots of different lakes where there's low abundance, what potentially could cause these invasive species here to move to the right side of this graph, where there's lots and lots of density and abundance of these invasives picking up? Well, from work done through the LTR, a lot of it led by Mike Spear, there's a lot of different things that can sort of cause a sudden shift in our lakes or rivers to influence a boom in invasive species. One of them being food web dynamics. So say there's an addition of a predator, a prey resource sort of dwindles, it can kind of change the conditions to where all of a sudden an invasive becomes very, very competitive and their populations can boom, and then they don't have any natural predators, and they can cause lots of ecological consequences to that system. Also changes to climate or changes in seasonal and temperature cues. So say for whatever reason, summer is getting a little warmer and the seasons are getting a little bit longer. A lot of those what we call phenology, sort of the rhythm of when species emerge or spawn, a lot of those mismatches can harm native species more than they can invasives, and then invasives can benefit from this change in environmental conditions and their populations can explode. Or even things just like heavy rain events where a sudden influx of nutrients into the system, such as like phosphorus or nitrogen, from a big rainstorm that dumps a bunch of water all at once, might change some sort of population or environmental condition that's going to allow an invasive species to explode in a given system. And so sort of looking out for these kind of triggers and how vulnerable systems are to it can help us understand where and when invasive species might be benefit from such changes. But we also know that invasive species tend to go through these boom-bust cycles. Here is a plot of zebra mussel density in the Hudson River, where it starts super low in the 90s, and then their densities explode, and they sort of do this seesaw pattern through time. And some of this is driven by just density dependence. So when there's a ton of an individual population, they can use up too many of the resources themselves, and so they crash, which then just leaves them to build up once again. And we're learning here in Lake Mendota that zebra mussels are likely no different. So this is a plot of the relative abundance of zebra mussels around like 2016, 2017, at the peak of zebra mussel invasion. They invaded, or at least were reported in Mendota in 2016, but really boomed in 2017, 2018. And we see their length frequency is about 10 to 20 millimeters. But from some of the works that my colleagues down at the Center for Limnology and other folks, we sort of redid these surveys this last summer. And we saw, so this red dashed line is the same sort of size range on that other plot. And we're seeing that zebra mussels are way smaller than they used to be, than we're seen in Lake Mendota. And some preliminary work from our dives and surveys that will be coming out in the next year or two is we're seeing about 10% of peak density of zebra mussels in Lake Mendota that we did before. Now, what caused this? Could be a number of things. Some preliminary work that we've been working on is it's a mix of changes in temperature regimes, as well as some years of drought versus this sudden influx of a bunch of rain that we got this last summer. May have been too chaotic for some of the zebra mussel populations. They're not able to get to their year 2 and year 3 ages. But just because we're seeing a decline in zebra mussels right now in Lake Mendota doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be gone forever, as they can sort of sit at these low abundances to then boom once again. And so we're doing lots of work to try and figure out what are potential causes that can make them explode once again in Lake Mendota, or maybe learn from some of the drivers that cause them to decline in the first place. And so moving on from to our next lesson is invasive species impacts can occasionally be enormous and far-reaching. So this is when not when an invasive species is lying at a low abundance in a lake, but when it booms and has lots and lots of violence. And so a great example of this is actually right here at Lake Mendota. Once again, is spiny water flea right there. That's about the size of a penny, just for reference of size. And the reason that spinies get a bad rap is that they're voracious predators of zooplankton. So if you don't know what zooplankton is, they're basically, think of like a cow eating grass, but instead of grass, they're eating algae. So if we get lots more zooplankton in the lake, we tend to get clear water. When it tends to be clear water in late May, early June, that's when zooplankton tend to be at their highest densities, and we call it a clear water phase. But when spiny water flea invaded, Jake Walsh, who is a researcher at the Center for Limnology, now at University of Minnesota, but he calculated from the impacts of spiny water flea that if you put about 8 years of spiny diet, how much the spiny water flea in Mendota were eating on a scale, it would weigh as much as the population of Madison, which is just an insane metric, especially for a state that relies so much on beer and cheese. But so they're eating a lot. And we actually saw immense impacts from this. So like I said, less soups is equal more algae. So some of y'all may remember the stocking of walleye or piscivorous predators into Lake Mendota back in the day. And we actually gained a full meter, so 3 feet of water clarity from those additions of predatory fish, because they were eating other fish that were eating the zooplankton. But when spiny water flea invaded, we lost that meter of water clarity. And so that can be as an immense impact with a tiny creature. But from work that, like I said, Jake Walsh and also Ichiro Matsuzaki, who was a researcher, a visiting researcher at the Center for Limnology, found that there was this reversal of years of water quality improvement, as well as changes in the seasonality of blooms, where when that clear water period happened was later and shorter. We're also seeing that they can have sort of ecosystem-wide effects. One of my undergrads that I work with at the Center for Limnology, she is currently looking, this is Aletta Bergman, she's looking at how spiny invasion is potentially driving changes in ecosystem carbon cycling in Trout Lake, lake up in the Northwoods, beautiful, and one of our lakes that we've been studying since 1981, at least in the long-term research program. And what she's been finding is that, so these, the darker blue lines here are the years where we had, where spiny water flea invaded Trout Lake, and the lighter blue years are before then. And we're seeing, particularly in this sort of fall, anyway, in the fall period, we're seeing a lot lower of sediment flux. So this is carbon that is settling to the bottom of the lake. And there's also changes in the quality of that sediment in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratios during the invasion, particularly in the fall when spiny water flea are most active. And this has really big implications for carbon cycling and carbon storage in aquatic lakes or in freshwater lakes. And so we're seeing potentially these massive ecosystem-wide changes just from spiny water flea invasion. And in Lake Mendota, there we go. We're also seeing changes in the seasonality of nutrient concentration. So the y-axis here is dissolved reactive silica. This is a nutrient that's super important for diatoms, which are a type of algae that we find on the lake, particularly in the early spring and late fall. And then on the x-axis is sort of medium dissolved phosphorus after turnover, after the lake mixes in the fall. And what this tells us, or this relationship is basically the silica is telling us how aggressively the diatoms bloom in the lake. They're really, really good food for zooplankton as well as some fish species, and how much nutrients was left over at the end of the growing season. And looking from about 1980 to 2008, sort of not really a strong relationship between these two variables. But when spiny water flea invaded, we add in those years. That green point at the very top in the rest of the cloud, that's 2009. And then the remaining years, really, we saw a lot less phosphorus left over at the end of the growing season, which tells us that there's a lot more primary production or algal growth during the summer. So they're changing how much nutrients are being left over, as well as the algal dynamics or the phytoplankton dynamics in Lake Mendota. And then when we had tube mussels invade, that relationship switched. So both of these invasions are affecting Lake Mendota in different ways, and potentially interacting with each other to change how the Lake Mendota is going to be able to fuel algal growth over the course of the summer, and the timing of those as well, especially in the kinds of algae that we see out there, diatoms versus cyanobacteria, which are harmful algal blooms and can cause lots of toxins, which I'll get into in a little bit as well, actually in this next one. Which brings me to my next lesson, which is that invasive species can affect microbes. So Robin Rohr was a student at Center for Limnology, working with Trina McMahon, and she showed that invasives in Lake Mendota affected this phenology, sort of the timing of when we see cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms in the lake. And we also saw a longer time period where there was more toxins. So harmful algal blooms are harmful because they produce cyanotoxins as a sort of secondary metabolite, which causes all our issues, and why you don't want to have your pets or small children drinking that green soupy water we find a lot in Mendota and Monona. But Robin found that spiny water flea had the greatest impact on bacteria seasonality, so where they were appearing in the season. So just to orient you to this plot, the 0 on the x-axis is the number of days since that clear water phase started, that period of clear water and higher zooplankton density in the lake. And the y-axis is the amount of the algal community that is cyanobacteria. And after spiny water flea, we see there's a lot more cyanobacteria budding up to that start of the clear water phase, whereas before it'd be much later into the summer. And zebra mussels had a really big impact on when we were seeing cyanobacteria in the lake, pushing even before the clear water phase started. You might even see a lot of these algal scums in April and really early in Lake Mendota now. And a lot of that we saw after zebra mussel invasion. And this had the additional effect of greater cyanobacteria toxicity across these seasons, a lot of that driven by zebra mussels, or we saw a lot of it after zebra mussels had invaded, where there's more microcystin, which is one of those cyanotoxins. And some of the mechanisms behind that, which we think, is that zebra mussels in Lake Mendota are grazing on all of the smaller and nicer forms of algae in the lake, leaving behind a lot of this cyanobacteria that can be more toxic and allowing cyanobacteria to compete even further. That's our hypothesis. We're doing lots of work right now to sort of get at those interactions in Lake Mendota between cyanobacteria and zebra mussels. In fact, this past summer, me and my team, there's Joey Munoz, Sophie Corsaro, and Jacqueline Mayer, who's a grad student on the project. We did a huge swath of environmental and microbial data analysis focused on getting at the cyanobacteria invasive interaction through both these in-lab experiments, as well as taking about a bunch of samples out on Lake Mendota. I'd love to present a lot of the results from that work, but DNA extraction takes a lot of time, or at least my undergrads tell me, and it's still being processed. But once we have that, it's going to really address a lot of these questions we have about how are zebra mussels interacting with cyanobacteria in a lake like Lake Mendota that's very nutrient rich and has a lot of these harmful algal bloom issues. So for this next lesson, impoundments act as invasive species hotspots and stepping stones. I'm going to step away a bit from Lake Mendota and Monona and broaden out to some of the other Wisconsin waters, including Wisconsin River or Mississippi River specifically, to talk about big head carp and silver carp. These are, I think that's a big head carp. My fish ID is ironically very poor. But we're one of these invasive carp that has sort of taken over the Mississippi River and the lower reaches, and are now in the last couple of years starting to move up towards the reaches of the Mississippi near Wisconsin and Minnesota. And they're both ecologically and economically disastrous invaders because of what they're eating, as well as some of these effects they have just flying out and hitting people in the head. And like I said before, that invasion front is rapidly moving up from Missouri, Iowa to Wisconsin and Minnesota, which is a little, you might think is a little confusing, as a lot of times along the Mississippi River, you have these here is a dam, which obviously is going to block a lot of that passage of fish. And the upper Mississippi River in particular is characterized by this series of locks and dams creating barriers to fish movement, where these pools can, in between the locks and dams, can act as stepping stones to those invasions. And that's true of not just invasive carp, but also for other invasives in the Mississippi River, as a dam system is going to be more disturbed than a native system would be, which tends to actually favor invasive species because they can handle those greater disturbances more readily. But the reason that fish can sort of use these as stepping stones, gather strength in a certain river pool, and then move on, is because there's of course locks that are crossing all these dams, and when those locks are open, the fish can sort of just chill in the lock, wait for the boat that's also, or the river barge, to equalize with the pool ahead of it, and then continue up the river. But there's also flooding that can occur, where it effectively creates open river conditions for long stretches of the Mississippi River, where water levels raise. They have to open up parts of the dam or the lock to make sure all the water levels are equalized. And a lot of that's happening more and more frequently as we see more intense rainstorms and flooding events from climate change. And when we look just at invasive carp movement between a low sort of precipitation year in 2022 versus 2023, these fish, and each of these arrows denotes a fish that had a tracker inside of it, and at each of these locks and dams, there's a series of sort of sensors. So it pings when they pass by. And if you, we go back to the map, the lock and dam 19 to lock and dam 5 is a vast stretch of river. And these invasive carp are spanning that in only a couple of days, which is pretty incredible. But that's sort of what's can be driving a lot of the spread of invasive carp. And this work that was published last year is a lot of this being done by federal scientists at the USGS, along with US Fish and Wildlife Service and US Army Corps of Engineers, building out this network of sensors to help us understand the drivers of invasive movement and figure out where are the most cost-effective and efficient ways that we can start limiting the spread and understanding how these fish are moving better so we can slow down that invasion front of silver carp. A lot of that, here they're putting in a CO2 and sound barrier in one of these locks, which can really help limit the spread of these invasive carp upriver. And so just shout out, coordinated across all these different states and stakeholders is why federal science is very important. Just give a quick shout out to federal science. So our next lesson, impacts of invasive control can sometimes be greater than the impacts of invasive species themselves. So there's lots of control efforts for invasive plants, and they can sometimes tend towards herbicides like 2,4-D, which can have a lot of unintended consequences, especially for targeting Eurasian water milfoil. Unfortunately, herbicide use has been linked to declines in zooplankton, fish, recruitment failure, native plant declines, as well as poor water quality from a lot of downstream effects that are hard to determine. I believe this was a lot of this work done with LTR affiliated folks and LTR data are tracking our understanding of these new herbicides as they come online. What are their effects on fish and what are their effects on native plants to figure out which ones are effective, which ones are not effective. And a lot of that work was done in Wisconsin lakes. And luckily, after stopping the application of herbicide, we did see those declines reversed once the treatment is over. But that's not always the case in different lakes. And so sometimes things that we do to try and control invasive species can end up causing more harm than good. Or there could be a situation where expensive invasive removal can result in high costs with little water quality improvement to show for it. From some work that I recently published, I was looking at this big common carp removal in a bunch of Iowa lakes. They threw on big buffalo as well as sort of an economic incentive. And if we were to see big changes in the food web after this removal of these fish, namely common carp, we'd expect to see pretty big negative relationships in these plots. But we saw very little change in these plots over time. And the removal really had almost no effect on water quality. This was because of a lot of different factors. But just sort of in general, there are really no silver bullets for invasive species management. And doing work that we do at the Center for Limnology or the North Temperate Lakes LTER can help us learn from successes and failures to develop better invasive management. And luckily, because a lot of the work that we do, ecosystem vulnerability to invasion can be estimated. So if you look at a picture like this is this Vilas County up there, the Northwoods, tons and tons of lake, very lake-rich region. And if we understand which lakes are more vulnerable to invasives, it can help guide and inform decisions about allocating limited management effort and resources. Obviously, if we tried to sample every single one of these lakes, that would be an insane amount of time and work for lots of folks. Which is the next point here. And so work done by folks at the Center for Limnology, as well as in collaboration with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, we're starting to develop these frameworks or strategies where we can resist, direct, or accept sort of invasive spread, and look at what lakes are most vulnerable to invasive species, which lakes where is it very unlikely for invasives to spread to, and which lakes are basically sitting ducks for invasions, and if we throw effort into it, it'd just be throwing money into a pit. And so trying to figure out sort of which lakes on the landscape to direct resources to has been a lot of the focus of effort by folks like Zach Feiner, who's with us at the Center for Limnology and also with Wisconsin DNR. And the NTL LTR researchers are developing lots more models to forecast habitat suitability for a number of invasive species across Wisconsin lakes and rivers. And so finally, for the last point, a bit of hope. Invasive species removal can produce ecosystem shifts and long-term benefits. And complete eradication is sometimes the goal, but it can be really expensive and difficult and costly. But this lake right here is a great example of the benefits of some of our invasive species management. This is Lake Wingra. And some folks might remember the big carp removal led by Dick Latham at the time, as well as Wisconsin DNR researchers in the Center for Limnology. And some recent work by Adriana Gorski are sort of looking at what were the changes after this big exclusion. They basically, that square of lake is where they excluded carp from. You see, so the no carp in the square, pretty great water quality. The rest of it was very, very green. So like, okay, let's do some effort, get rid of all these carp. They removed tons of carp and saw a dramatic increase in water clarity and sort of where and aquatic plant growth all across Lake Wingra itself. So this was a big success story of removing carp and keeping their populations low. Another, Gretchen Hansen, again, led an effort in Sparkling Lake up north to remove rusty crayfish, which was leading to declines in a lot of native fishes, native crayfish, as well as aquatic plants in those lakes. Again, LTR researchers collaborated with fisheries managers that harvested game fish, or limited harvest on game fish that consume crayfish, and at the same time trapping and removing lots and lots of rusties. And over 8 years of removal, we saw about a 95% or more decline in rusty crayfish in Sparkling Lake. And sometimes we're also seeing that lakes can adapt a bit. So this is a sort of a diagram of the pelagic or the deep water food web of Trout Lake, one of the lakes up north that we studied. It had spiny water fleet invade after 2014. And after 20 years, we saw evidence that the Cisco in Trout Lake were very instrumental in adapting to spiny water flea invasions. So I'm not going to bore you with all the math involved in making this plot, but those big spikes show basically the area times of instability within Trout Lake. But you'll notice that it only happened for a year once spiny water flea first invaded, and again when their populations increased a little bit more recently. But the lake returned to sort of pre-invasion levels or stability, which is evidence that the lake had sort of adapted to spiny water flea and was able to control these bursts of this new eruptions of spinies in Trout Lake. And so, given all this, I do want to thank, I personally wasn't involved in writing this paper, but I benefited greatly in a lot of the work that NTL LTR has done, and have hopefully we'll be getting out some great information on invasive species and what we've learned from them in the future. Want to thank the Center for Limnology, as well as the North Pivot Lakes long-term ecological research program, which has funded and supported a whole swath of fantastic researchers that have done lots of great work here in Madison, as well as across the state. With that, I'll happily take any questions. My email is up there. Folks have, if I don't get to a question here, and I also have a website there for some other research that I'm working on more recently. Thanks.
Tyler, I think we'll leave the mic with you.
Okay.
That way.
I'll repeat the question.
Exactly. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll bounce around the room and try to get to everybody in the next 15 minutes or so.
Can you speak to what adaptations were made in Trout Lake that kind of got spiny water flea under control?
Yeah, so the question is what adaptations were made by spiny waterfleet to get, or by Cisco, or adaptations in Trout Lake to get spiny waterfleet under control? Yeah, so it was less so than adaptation and more we saw Cisco that were already fairly dense in Trout Lake when spiny waterfleet invaded. From some work that Ben Martin and Joe Murnack did on Trout Lake, they saw that after a year or two after spiny waterfleet first invaded, the amount of production that spiny waterfleet were able to do, so how they're able to reproduce and continue their population, was not keeping pace with how much Cisco were likely preying on them. And so it was more Cisco learned of a new prey resource after a bit of time. And because their populations are so strong in Trout Lake, that it's likely what we saw them able to see, we saw a decline in spiny waterfleet after a few years. They popped up again in density, spiny waterfleet did a few years ago, but the changes in the rest of the food web were far less severe than their first invasion, which is some evidence that the food web had sort of adapted to spiny waterfleet in some sense. And there's still, that's our hypothesis, at least there's still some work on it, but it sort of is a story of strong Cisco populations, at least in some of these northern lakes, might help buffer against some of these spiny invasions.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
I have
I-
a question for you. Number 9, you talked about how actions can be effective, and you talked about Lake Wingrove with their carp. But then in number 7, you were showing how increased costs with very little improvement, and you mentioned carp removal there. So how was Wingrove's carp removal successful, whereas other people's weren't?
Yeah, so the question is, so I talked about how some of these invasive removal actions can be successful, but also they can be costly and non-effective, and how they sort of square with each other. So the question is, I think it goes to, there is no real silver bullet approach to a single removal. So the big difference between what happened in Wingrove is it was had lots of state support, and they really they found in Lake Wingrove from surveys that we've been doing on Lake Wingrove for with the LTR that the carp tended to congregate in the middle of the lake. And so in the winter they basically put a big square in the ice and were able to scoop out tons and tons of carp. And then I don't believe this is published, but it's been sort of, the hypothesis is that the bluegill population in Wingrove is so strong, they're able to like feed on some of the carp eggs, or the egg bank that was there, sort of keeping their numbers low even far after removal. The other example I showed was a bit of a different approach to removal. So what happened in Wingrove, obviously, those big coordinated removals with fully state agency funded programs can be expensive. And so the state of Iowa tried to implement this idea of doing incentivized contracts where they go to a commercial fisherman, they bid on a lake, so you can remove however many pounds of big mouth buffalo, which are about $3 a pound, if you take out X pounds of carp, which are only like 75 cents a pound. Which was the harvest in that case ended up being a little more heterogeneous or variable than like a concerted removal effort would be, which likely led to the limited water quality response we saw in that instance. And so it's sort of the management that you do to a lake, I think, is most effective when you really understand that lake and we have good sort of scientific backing of, all right, these are what this specific system is doing, and this is how the invasive is interacting with it. Which I think a lot of the LTR is trying to do in their science and help us better understand how these invasives can operate in lakes in different contexts to have more effective management.
Your example with the bluegill in Lake Wingrove, does that suggest that perhaps introducing bluegill in other lakes could be beneficial to carp control because you get the eggs eaten?
Yeah, so the question was, the suggestion I made about bluegill potentially keeping carp populations low in Lake Wingrove. And again, this is just a hypothesis, I don't have any data on this. Would it be effective to just add bluegill to other lakes to in similar manners? And I think I'll also go back to that, you know, there is no silver bullet. Like what happened in Lake Wingrove, because of the specific system set up and how that ecosystem is construed, that was successful in that case. it may be successful in other lakes, but we'd have to understand what the other contexts, in terms of nutrients, what fish are there, what the prey resources are, to know if that would be effective. And so really, the frustrating answer is, it's almost always a lake by lake, basis, but sort of having that broad understanding of how these things interact in different contexts, I think, can help us get to that point of some more broad strokes of these kinds of lakes, we can do this, these kinds of lakes, we can do that.
So just doubling down on local biologists and having that local knowledge is so crucial.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial, yeah.
Are there any trends in the quagga mussel densities of populations? It sounds like you said that zebra mussel populations were declining and getting smaller as individual, but the quaggas were still increasing.
So quaggas are in the, aren't in Lake Mendota, it's solely zebra mussels. I know less about quagga mussel. I know that they're sort of boomed in the Great Lakes and have caused and they're sort of more effective than zebra, or they can outcompete zebra mussels because zebra mussels rely on hard substrate, whereas quagga mussels can colonize both hard and soft substrate. Like and they go down really deep into the Great Lakes as well. But most invasive species follow those boom bust patterns. There's of course exceptions. But I would imagine if we started to see, the emergence of a quagga mussel or the occurrence of a quagga mussel in Lake Geneva, that's a trend towards we're going to start seeing quaggas in other Wisconsin lakes. I'd imagine probably a similar pattern would emerge. And I forgot to repeat the question, but the question was about zebra mussel versus quagga mussel boom bust dynamics, like I talked about before. But yeah, in Lake Mendota, we're not quite confident yet whether this is just a boom bust cycle or there's some other environmental drivers that are causing their decline. Some of the work that Nick had done showed that the sort of two drought year, like really low precipitation years, 2 or 3 years ago, when the lake froze and the water level was way lower, that might have, the ice might have froze on some of the rocks and areas that the zebra mussels like to colonize, which may have, then the following year, their population was so damaged over winter that they weren't able to repopulate. And so some of the work that the Clean Lakes Alliance is doing in collaboration with Center for Limnology is setting out some bricks onto folks' docks. Feel free to contact them if you want to be part of that program, but leaving them out into the lake, seeing how many zebra mussels colonize those bricks, and then bringing them to us at the Center for Limnology to get a better sense of zebra mussel populations through time.
Do you have any update on that? I was one of the ones dropping the brick.
Yeah, I don't have any update. I know that lots of folks brought them in, and I know that Emily Stanley and folks are working on taking the size measurements and densities of those zebra mussels. And then I've been away from the CFL for the last couple months, but I know that they are excited about all the data they're able to collect, and especially if we keep doing this for a couple of years, getting a sense of what are the populations looking like in Lake Mendota.
Monona,
Right.
Windbrook, Augusta.
Yeah, all of them.
Francis Starkweather Creek recently did a pretty big survey of the level of PFAS in the waters of Dane County, and definitely verified that Lake Mendota is nice and clean with PFAS, as compared to Starkweather Creek and then flowing into all the downstream lakes from Mendota, which are pretty highly contaminated with PFAS. And I'm wondering if any of your studies are looking at any differences in these lakes that might be due to something like that contaminant or other contaminants that is affecting the viability or distribution or anything of any of the invasives. And I'm just wondering, I've read some things about the impacts on the ecosystem generally with PFAS, but I was just wondering if anybody's doing any work with that, since we have the issue right here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about, is there anything with the PFAS in here in the problems with PFAS in the Yahara chain of lakes, and whether that might have some impact or influence on invasive species spread or invasive growth in the Yahara chain. So I personally haven't done much work with PFAS, but I know that there's lots of UW-Madison researchers that are asking those questions and collecting data specifically on PFAS and how it's affecting things like algal growth and the native fish in Lake Mendota, Monona, and down the chain. My informed guess, I guess I would say, would be that we tend to see when there's more disturbance in a system that's usually going to favor invasive species. They're more tolerant to change, like broad swaths of environmental conditions. That's why they are invasive. They can spread so rapidly. And so I would assume that it is probably a factor in how successful an invasion or maybe one of those population conditions that might cause a low sleeper population to erupt into a system. But I personally haven't seen any work on sort of PFAS invasives connections. But I would assume there definitely is stuff there, and folks at Madison are definitely looking into it, and researchers that are asking those questions.
Time for one more.
Is there any evidence of predation of zebra mussel veligers by spiny water fleas? And is that something that you're looking in, and as far as the Mendota and your hair chain in general? And maybe that's playing into the population shifts?
Yeah, that's it. So the question was about, is there any evidence of spiny water flea preying on zebra mussel veligers? And veligers are basically the larval form of zebra mussels. They produce these microscopic little D-shaped larvae, then they go around and then settle onto rocks. I think the veligers might be too big for spiny water fleas specifically, but we collected a bunch of veliger data this summer actually to see, like, in 2024, how does it compare to what Mike Spear collected in 2018, see if there's any changes in the levels of veligers being produced. And I know some works by the lab manager at the Van der Zanden lab is we're looking at predation from freshwater drum and carp that have been visually observed feeding on some zebra mussels in Lake Mendota. We're planning to do some exclusion experiments to see if that might be part of the decline as well. And so it's something we're thinking about.
Tyler, thank you so much for your talk today. Appreciate it. We'll wrap up with a few final notes for y'all. If you do have any questions that pop up later, I think we got to everything in this room, but this is actually going to be on YouTube tomorrow. So if you share this around and you have any questions that come up from the folks that you're sharing it with, please email Clean Lakes Alliance. We'll get your info over to Tyler. We'll get those answers to you. So it's info@cleanlakesalliance.org. You can always just send an email, whatever, to say hi. That's also okay. Please mark your calendar, May 13th. I did it while James was up here earlier because I did not have it on my calendar yet. That's our community breakfast and our Loop the Lake bike ride. That is June 14th. Last year was a ton of fun, so we'd love to see more folks out there this year so we can hit that 2,000 goal. Our upcoming Clean Lakes 101 is going to be Tuesday, April 15th. I'm throwing a lot of dates out. I like everyone making notes here. This is good. That's when we're going to unveil the results of the economic impact study of the Yahara Chain Lakes. So it's going to be a big one. You definitely don't want to miss that one. One final thing, there's some surveys on your table right now. I really would appreciate it if you guys filled that out for the Clean Lakes Alliance staff. Kind of gives them a heads up of what you want to hear about, what kind of speakers you want to have come up here. So it only makes the experience better for you, and it helps our Clean Lakes Alliance staff just continue to do really good work and continue to amplify these 101s. So if you do have, again, any questions, info@cleanlakesalliance.org. Otherwise, I think we will see you April 15th. That'll be our next one. Thank you so much for joining us today, guys. Have a great evening.